Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Charles Good. Most of the work that matters today doesn't happen in isolation. It happens inside teams. Leadership teams, project teams, cross-functional teams, hybrid teams, and fast-moving groups of people trying to solve problems that no one can solve alone. And that's where so many organizations either accelerate or get stuck. Because a great team does more than just divide up the work. It raises the quality of the thinking. It creates momentum. And it makes people sharper, faster, and more capable than they would have been on their own. But we've all experienced the opposite as well. Teams that drain energy, bury people in meetings, avoid real conversations, and confuse activity with progress. So the question is not simply how do we build better teams? The deeper question is what separates the teams that consistently outperform from those that quietly make the work harder. My guest today has spent decades studying this question at scale. Dr. Ron Friedman is a social psychologist, founder of Ignite 80, and best-selling author of The Best Places to Work, Decoding Greatness, and his new book, Superteams, The Science and Secrets of High-Performing Teams, built on research from thousands of professionals with more than 100,000 data points. In this episode, we're going to unpack what the best teams actually do differently, not in theory, but in everyday behaviors, systems, and norms that allow people to perform at their best. I hope you enjoy. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm Charles Good. This show is built for leaders, managers, and high achievers who want to think better, grow faster, and perform under pressure. Each episode, I sit down with leading researchers, best-selling authors, and experts to uncover what actually works, the practical tools, proven strategies, and insights you can use when the pressure is real. Because in a world that keeps changing, the edge belongs to those who can outlearn what worked yesterday, outthink what's coming next, and outperform when it counts. Welcome to the program, Ron.
Thanks for having me, Charles.
So before we get in, I'd love for our learners to learn more about you and what got you excited and wanting to write more about teams and super teams.
Well, if you're not familiar with my background, I started off as a psychology professor teaching at colleges and universities, and then I went off into the corporate world. And what I discovered while being in the corporate world is that there's a massive divide between the latest science and the modern workplace. And it's everything from the way that companies hire to the way that managers motivate to the basic layout of the modern office. So I turned my attention to writing a book. That was my first book. It was called The Best Place to Work. And in it, I took over 1,000 academic studies and translated them into plain English so that regardless if you're just someone starting out or you're a CEO, you have access to the best research on how you create a great workplace. But there was something missing from that book, and that is what do the best teams do differently? Because even within the best organizations, there's a range of levels, right? Some teams are great, some teams are not so great. What do the best teams do differently? And so this research was sparked by a research project that was brought to me by a Silicon Valley company. They asked me if I would be willing to do a study on how the best teams operate. And I wrote an article about our findings, and that ended up being in the Harvard Business Review. It was called 5 Things High-Performing Teams Do Differently. And the article ends up going viral. And it is one that continues to be read throughout the world to this day. It's now the second most widely read article in HBR's history. And that helped me understand that people were really interested in how we can collaborate more effectively. And so my team and I then ran now up to, I think, 7 additional studies on what the best teams do differently. And all of that is delivered in super teams where it gives you really a comprehensive playbook for how the best teams operate.
I love that approach and I love the book. But before we get into the book, you spent 3 books now reverse engineering how the best in the world work. So I have to ask, when you built your own research team for super teams, did it qualify as a super team?
It's interesting. So let me first explain what a super team is and how we uncovered it. And I know I'm going to be stepping over many of your questions, so I apologize in advance. But here's how we did this research. So we polled thousands of workers and we asked them 2 simple questions about their teams. And those questions were, how effective is your team at achieving its goals? And the second question is, compared to other teams in your industry, how would you rate your team's performance? And then we took the teams with a perfect score. It was a very small number of groups. It's about 8% of teams qualify as super teams. And we looked to see what do the super teams do differently. And we looked at everything from how they structure their day to how they run their meetings to even how they recover on evenings and weekends. And we found that there are 3 key differences that separate out average teams from super teams. And we put them into broad buckets. And so here are the 3 big buckets that separate a average team from a super team. Number one, super teams get more done by better managing their time, energy, and attention. That's the first difference. Second difference is they don't just collaborate well, they make one another better. And the third big bucket is even when things are going well, they're not satisfied. They're constantly looking to build their skills and improve over time. So those are the three things. If you have a team that gets more done by better managing time, energy, and attention, that makes one another better, that improves over time, you have a super team. So you asked me, do I have a super team? The answer is I think so. And the reason I have a super team is not because I've hired the right people, it's because we have identified the key practices that make for a super team. So for example, under improving over time, when things are going well, one of the ways that you improve over time is you experiment. You run more experiments because experiments teach you new ways in which you can improve. And so my team and I are constantly running experiments. Every email we send out is an A/B test of different subject lines. So we can determine what gets more open. So that's an example of a tiny experiment that can help you improve over time. And no matter what it is that you do, there's ways for you to run tiny experiments that help you improve over time. And unless there's that appetite for new learnings and insights, you're going to stand still and you're going to invariably fall behind over time. So that's the problem I think a lot of teams run into is they get really good and then they get complacent. And you can't be complacent if you're going to continue to be on top. And so to answer your question, yeah, I think we had a super team. I hope we had a super team, but at the very least, we applied a lot of what we learned from the research to our team.
Well, and I love those three parts, but I also realize that leaders listening can't fix all three at once. So when you look across your research, which one of those three is usually the highest leverage entry point for a leader who wants to upgrade their team?
I think it's the first one, which is getting better, which is they get more done by better managing their time and energy and attention. And the reason I say that is that I feel like it's the first domino. In other words, if you can get that right, if you can help your team remove some of the time sinks throughout their day, that opens up the pathway to doing the other two buckets better. So people need more free time in order to make one another better, in order to keep getting better and improve over time. So unless people have the ability to put real work hours towards getting real work done, everything is going to be harder. And so it's about teaching leaders a skill that my team and I call focus amplification. And it's about replacing the endless barrage of meetings and messages with opportunities for doing real focused work during the day. And once you do that, you open up so much time in people's calendars that enables them to then do those other steps well, creating the opportunity for building a super team.
I love that. And I agree with you as well, because when you clean up focus, meetings, and daily structure, you free up an enormous amount of cognitive bandwidth, right? That not only improves output right away, but it creates space for the other two pillars. People finally have the energy, like you said, and time to invest in helping each other grow and reflecting on how to improve the overall system.
Exactly. If people are constantly fighting to create free time, nobody has the bandwidth for any of that, let alone the free time. So one of the interesting findings in our research is that when you ask people, if you had free time during the day, in other words, a meeting was canceled, what would you do at that time? And so on average teams, people tend to say, I would focus on a personal chore or I'd go home early. On super teams, people are more likely to go to their teammates and say, hey, what do you need help with? And that just provides evidence for what happens when people have more time on their calendar. On super teams, once you've built the conditions for people to want to support one another, they don't selfishly hoard their hours for themselves. They're looking for ways to make one another better.
Well, let's stay with the idea of design because it challenges a very common assumption in leadership circles that I need great individuals on my team. And here's what most executives I talk to believe, that if they hire enough A players, a great team just emerges. But what did your data actually show?
Well, I think a lot of the leadership books that we encounter talk about getting the right people on the bus. And that's a good idea if you're building a team from scratch. But most leaders aren't building teams from scratch. They're dealing with the team they've inherited or the team they happen to have right now. And so in this book, we were more interested in what are the habits and practices and behaviors that any leader can apply or individual can apply to their team to bring out the best in one another. And that's what this is really about. So yeah, I think there's value to hiring for certain characteristics, for having the right skills that enable people to perform at a high level. But the reality is, if you're not hiring from scratch, that kind of advice is fairly useless and maybe a little depressing because If you don't have the ability to bring on the people you want to bring on, whether it's because you can't find them or because you don't have the budget, what use is that information to you? And so this is all about how do you take a team that you have and make them better?
So, like you said, talent is necessary, but without the right environment, it's kind of like having a race car stuck in traffic. The design of the workplace is the multiplier or the limiter on whatever talent you do have.
That's a great point. And on top of that, I would say a lot of people think if you add an A player, then you raise the level of the team. But actually, unless you have the fundamentals in place, it can actually complicate things because that A player likely will have an ego because they know they're good. And then what often ends up happening is a diffusion of responsibility where people feel like, well, the A player is going to take care of it, so I don't need to work quite as hard. This might be a good opportunity to take a step back and talk about how do you create a team mentality. And this is something I address in the introduction of the book because most teams are not real teams. Just because people happen to work together in the same department or division doesn't mean they're actually a real team. And I think a lot of organizations are missing this critical piece. And so how do you take a group of strangers and turn them into a team? Well, you need three things. The first thing you need is a shared goal. You need one outcome that everyone is pushing for together. So for example, if I'm interested in going home at 5 o'clock because I want to take my kids to a soccer game and Charles, you are looking to get promoted, we have conflicting goals. And that's going to lead to tension. We need a single outcome that everyone's pushing for together. The second thing you need role clarity. This is another thing that a lot of teams are missing. I need to know what I'm responsible for and what you're responsible for and how our responsibilities intersect. If we don't have a clear division of labor, you're going to have balls dropped or you're going to have turf wars, and either one of those is problematic. And the third thing you need interdependence. And that's just a fancy psychological term that means we need to feel like we need each other to be successful in order for ourselves to achieve the goals we're trying to achieve. So if you're on a sales team and each person has their own individual sales quota, that's not interdependence because what's going to happen is we're going to see each other as competitors. And so no wonder we don't have that team mentality. And so you need to have the three things working in tandem to create a team mentality. You need to have that sense of a shared goal. You need to have role clarity, and you need to have interdependence. If any one of those is missing, you're going to have a recipe for dysfunction. I think this is why so many organizations struggle with their team because they're not building real teams. But again, this book isn't just about building real teams. It's about how do you take a real team and then move it to the next level, because a team mentality will only get you so far. In today's day and age, having a team mentality is great, but if you're spending all of your week in meeting and email, you're not going to have a super team. And that's what the first part of the book, Superteams, is all about.
Let me push on method a little bit because you know what people say about success research? It's that survivorship bias. And you classified high-performing teams partly on how they rated themselves. How do you know quiet rooms, good meetings cost performance rather than already successful teams just having those nicer conditions?
Well, it's a great question. Here, we did something a little bit different. We didn't just look at survivorship bias. Just for everyone who's unfamiliar with the term, all it means is looking at people who have been successful and then assuming that everything they did was right, ignoring the fact that there might be other teams who did the same thing but didn't succeed. So for example, in the book, I talk about Mark Zuckerberg, who didn't graduate for college. And so you might look at his case study and say, okay, well, I guess going to college was a real waste of my time because otherwise I could have been Mark Zuckerberg. Well, actually, when you look at thousands of people who graduated from college, what you realize is that actually graduating from college is a good investment in terms of your overall lifetime salary. So here what we did was something similar, which is we didn't look at individual case studies. And a lot of business books are about case studies. And the problem with case studies, as you point out, is survivorship bias. You might have a lot of other teams that applied all those same insights but didn't get to the point where they were successful. And so looking at case studies has real limitations. So here what we did was we looked at thousands of teams across a wide range of industries and looked at what are the ones that are performing at a high level and then deconstructed what are the habits that enable them to achieve those successes. Now you might say, well, this is all self-report, so how do we know that's true? Well, actually we have research. This is very well established research over decades that the best predictor of a team's performance is how the team evaluates its performance. It's not the same thing as me saying I'm a great driver, because that's an individual assessment. This is an assessment about the team. And I bet if you ask most people the two questions that we talked about here at the beginning, which is how effective is your team reaching its goals? And two, compared to other teams in your industry, how would you rate your team's performance? If you're on a crap team, you're not going to have any trouble saying I'm not a 10 on that. But if I were to ask you, how good of a driver are you? That introduces some problems. So there's a lot of reasons to believe in the evidence that we have here, especially when you consider the exact practices that enable them to achieve a high level of performance, because a lot of it is backed by other research, and it makes also a great deal of intuitive sense.
Well, let's get into those design choices, starting with focus and environment, because you have some very counterintuitive findings there. Chapter one opens with a copywriter hiding in a soundproof recording booth with a flashlight just to get work done. Tell that story because I think half my audience felt that in their chest.
This is about Charles Benoit, and Charles is a friend of mine, so I know this story well. And Charles is a someone who left, much like me actually, was a teacher and ended up going into copywriting. Really liked the idea of working in an office, and at the beginning everything was great. This was before kind of the advent of email. It was had a great deal of success just being able to work on his own schedule. And then once emails started, and then the advent of the Outlook calendar, where everyone was able to carve out different pieces of his days for meetings. And then the only way for him to get work done was to hide in a soundproof booth with a flashlight so that no one could find him and he could actually do some real work during the day. And a lot of people, may not go to those extremes, but feel that sense of, man, I wish everyone would just leave me alone for a little bit so I can get my work done. And that's the reality. When we look at the average team and how the average person utilizes their time during the week, they tend to lose 18 hours a week to meetings, and then another 11 hours a week to messages, meaning email and text messages and Slack. That's 3/4 of their week gone before they've accomplished a single task. And so we end up spending so much of our time wondering, why are people so burnt out at work? A better question is, how do they manage to get any work done in the first place? If the 3/4 of their week is gone to meetings and messages, how on earth do people do this work? Well, what often happens, especially if you're someone who's smart and ambitious, is you come in early, you stay late, or you work weekends. It's the only way to stay above water. And that approach can serve you in the short term. But if you work like that for years on end, you're going to burn out. And what we find in our research is that super teams are much more intentional in how they use their time during the week.
I like some of those stats because they're sobering, right? The average worker spends 18 hours a week in meetings, and 70% say that those meetings get in the way of important tasks. 92% call them unproductive, and every interruption leaves what psychologists call attention residue. It's like that whiteboard that never fully erases over the day. You're thinking it's messier and slower. And I like what you say about super teams. They grasp that constant communication is not neutral. It can be deeply destructive to cognition.
That's exactly right. I think a lot of times organizations say we want collaboration, and collaboration is great. But what they get instead is they get constant togetherness. And that's not the same thing as collaboration. So if we're constantly on email, if we're constantly in meetings, we're going to pay a mental tax that prevents us from doing our best work. And if you look at creative teams and the ones that are highly productive, what you tend to find is that they toggle between individual solo work and then group contributions where people can refine the ideas they've come up with alone. And so the classic example is brainstorming. Everybody get into the conference room. We're all going to brainstorm. And we assume that that's how creativity happens. But in fact, what the research shows is that if you want people to have creative ideas, you want to have a lot of original thinking and high number of creative solutions, you're far better using a different approach called brain writing. And brain writing means people are coming up with 5 or 6 ideas on their own, and then they're bringing them into the conference room so that everyone can discuss those ideas. Because what happens when you brainstorm is that the first person who speaks ends up anchoring the entire conversation. And everyone in the room is now utilizing their time, energy, and attention, evaluating that idea instead of coming up with their own ideas. Even worse is if you just sit around in the brainstorm session, you end up feeling like you've contributed even though you haven't. But when you're forced to come up with 5 or 6 ideas before the meetings, you can't help but notice when you've come up with 0 ideas. And that creates a motivation for you to want to come up with more. And so you end up having diffusion of responsibility when you're brainstorming in a group, and that does not lead to high performance. And so that's just one example of how constant togetherness ends up undermining the very productivity it's designed to help us achieve.
So stop treating focus as a matter of individual willpower and start treating it as a team level design challenge. And I like what you say about the anchoring effect with them just coming together and starting with that brainstorming. I would add to that that when the senior leader starts first or the senior team member, then usually people coalesce around that as well. So if they can speak later in the brainstorming process, probably the better for the overall group and the ideas that are shared.
That's exactly right. And that's one of the research findings in this book is that on super teams, leaders are more likely to speak last because they want people to feel free to come up with their ideas. And the other thing is, if you have a great idea, it's far more useful for someone else to suggest it and for you to say, I really like that suggestion, as opposed to delivering it yourself. And so there's a quote in the book from Adam Grant, which is, the best leaders don't look to be the smartest person in the room. They're looking to make the room smarter. That's a really good way of framing it, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to develop a skill that brings out the best in other people. And a lot of us, I think, got to the position of leadership by being high performers. But when you get to a certain level, just being a high performer is not enough. You need to bring out the best in other people. And that's a completely different skill set.
You're right. And many people aren't ready to have that responsibility. When I see a lot of individual contributors moving into people roles, that's one thing I hear time and time again is that they struggle with that to say, I was successful because of what I could do. Now it's based on what my team can do, and I need to be a better developer of others, which I never got the skill set for.
Yeah. And on top of that, there's another skill that I think people are sorely lacking, which is how to be a good teammate. And I think it's one thing to be a high performer. It's a different thing to be a good teammate. So a good employee is someone who will keep their head down and get the work done. But a good teammate is someone who will do both of those things and make the people around them better. And I think that there are very specific, concrete things that we surface here in this research about how the best teammates make one another better that is vital for teaching teammates. And unfortunately, not something that people are ever taught, especially unless you come from a sports background. In sports, I think a lot of it is reinforced by generations of having gone through this and being surrounded by teammates and really seeing very clearly how your teammates' contributions help the team succeed. In the modern workplace, we don't have that. And so we need to teach people how to become good teammates. And it's not hard. It's not something people are necessarily going to oppose. It's just never kind of been explained to them in a way that helps them see how it benefits their career.
Well, you also tested a whole menu of perks, office dogs, slides, nap rooms, game tables, gyms. Out of all of them, exactly one predicted whether a team was high performing. Which one was that?
Yeah, this is something that surprised us when we did this research, because we thought, on the surface, any of these could conceivably help performance, because even if it's the office slide, which is obviously ridiculous, you could see that as a way of signaling that, hey, fun is useful. It's something that's rewarded here. We want you to have fun. And that might lead people to be more optimistic and higher performing in their workplace. And what we found is the only office amenity that actually predicts performance is having a quiet space to do focus work. And I think what that finding speaks to is how much people deeply desire just the ability to get their work done. And yet, when they show up at the office and so much of their time is cannibalized by meetings and messages, they just can't get that work done, and it leaves them feeling frustrated and resentful. And it makes them feel like helpless, right? Because they want to do good work and they can't do that work. And so what that finding suggests is that if you are trying to build a high-performing team, you really need to start with the office focus room, not the office gym. And I think it's a remarkable finding. It's one that I think also speaks to the fact that most offices are an attentional war zone. And this is why so many people prefer to work from home. It's because it allows them to actually get their work done. And why don't we think about building an office that actually empowers people to do their best work?
Well, and it makes sense, right? Because knowledge work, your primary production asset is your ability to think clearly, and noise and interruption chip away at that every minute.
Yeah, and what we find is super teams are much better at this. They don't just play defense. So let's talk about the defense first. So the one thing they do is they're much better at avoiding unnecessary meetings, 50% better at avoiding unnecessary meetings. They're 54% better at scheduling recurring meetings, and recurring meetings can become a time sink because they're so difficult to remove from your calendar. Once you and I have a recurring meeting on Tuesdays, I have to then have an awkward conversation saying to you, Charles, hey, I think our time together is no longer valuable. And that is going to hurt your feelings. And a lot of people prefer not to have that conversation, so they keep coming to the recurring meeting. The other thing they do is they play offense. They block out dedicated focus hours during the day where no one has to monitor their messages. They do things like meeting-free days, except they don't call them meeting-free days. They call them get things done days because they want to reinforce the purpose behind the initiatives. So what it comes down to, if you're trying to build a super team that gets more done, is you want to minimize distractions and maximize focus.
And you don't stop at the physical environment, though. You also introduced a concept called collaborative focus that gives managers a way to operationalize this. So this one surprised me because personal productivity hacks like headphones on, notifications off, batching email showed no positive relationship with team performance, none. And I've recommended those on this show. So why don't those help?
Listen, you're not alone. I used to teach productivity and I would recommend those too. And it's because we all thought that's the way you get things done is you prevent those interruptions from entering your workday. And what we find is actually those productivity hacks don't end up benefiting the team. And it's because one person, when you're working on a team, you're required to collaborate. And so if I unilaterally decide that I'm not going to be available to anybody on the team from 9:30 until 12:30 because I'm only batching my emails at 9 and at 1, that creates bottlenecks for everyone else on the team. And so, and you can see how this multiplies. If I'm only available at 9 o'clock and 1 o'clock, and you're only available between 9:30 and 1:30, now we're only communicating twice a day. It's a real problem. And so the solution is to have team level solutions for enabling people to do their focus work during the day. So dedicated focus blocks, meeting-free days, just really an agreement about these are the hours when we're all going to be live and interacting, and these are the hours when we're all going to keep our head down and get our work done. Having an approach like that is far more likely to yield a high-performing team than relying on productivity hacks that often complicate the day and create bottlenecks for everyone involved.
So my headphones on is really helping me, but could be hurting my team at the same time because then I'm really not having that collaborative focus that I need with them in those times of the day.
And it's also sending a signal that I'd rather be somewhere else. So there's that other implicit message that obviously may not be your intention, but I think it's what people take away from it. And so I used to teach productivity. I used to think that productivity was something that needed to be taught on the individual level. And to a certain extent, it's still true. But I think that productivity experts are solving the wrong problem because unless this is addressed at the team level, we're still going to have 18 hours a week of meetings and we're still going to be spending 11 hours a week on our email. And so there's even research showing that even the productivity hacks themselves may feel right, but don't actually help. So it's there's one productivity hack that says batch your email. So only look at your email 3 times a day. And that turns out not to lower stress. And it's because total time spent on email is what predicts stress, not how often you check it. And so if you're still spending 3 hours a day on email, it doesn't matter whether it's staggered or not. What matters is how much time of your day is lost to email. And so the other nice thing about having this collaborative approach to when we're all checking email together is that it creates less email, because now there's less opportunity for email. And I think people are also, because if they have that window of this is when we're interacting, they're more likely to pick up the phone and talk to each other.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. Reframe makes a lot of sense. Remember, I don't think great many
ideas
companies
only
are
matter
yet adopting
when they
it.
change
Hopefully they
what
will
you do
soon
next.
after reading your book. So choose one insight from
So the
today's
manager
conversation
listening
and put it into
wanted to borrow
practice
just 3
this
concrete
week.
practices from
If this
that
episode was
secret
valuable,
playbook chapter,
follow the
and
show
implement
and
them
share it
this
with someone
week.
who would benefit.
What would you
And
recommend?
until next
'Cause
time, remember,
a manager
the edge belongs
maybe wants
to
to hear
those
this
who
and act
outlearn
on
what
Monday.
worked yesterday, who
3
can
is
outthink
tough.
what's
I think
coming
most
next
people, if
so that they can
get them to do one
outperform
thing, that
when
would be
it
good.
counts.
Let me give you one thing, just because I can give you 3, but I don't want to overwhelm people. I think the highest leverage opportunity is to run an experiment with your team. Think about creating a focus block one time during the week where maybe for just 60 minutes, nobody needs to respond to emails and nobody can run a meeting. Maybe it's 3 to 4 on a Tuesday, and just run it as an experiment and see, does it help? Do people feel like they got a lot done? Did it reduce stress? And then talk with your team and see what the impact was and make a decision on whether you want to run another one of these focus blocks and maybe what the next experiment is. This is how super teams get better. You're not looking for a silver bullet. You're looking for tiny improvement. If you can get better every day or once a week, you're going to eventually get to where you need to go. But creating opportunities for people to get real work during the workday, I think that is the number one opportunity that most leaders need to take more advantage of.
Thank you, Ron, for a great conversation today, a great episode. It's been incredibly rich. What I appreciate about your new book, Superteams, is that it takes something every leader cares about, teams, and subjects them to real scrutiny rather than just repeating the usual cliches, which gives us a very specific lever on how to reduce collaboration overload, how to design for focus, how to build trust that's rooted in competence and predictability. Remind our listeners how they get in contact with you, learn more about your work, and get your latest best-selling book.
Thank you. So Superteams Inc. is the name of my company, and we do keynotes and workshops, and we help leaders apply some of these insights. The other thing I would say is if you're interested in what you just heard, we've created a resource for you that gives you the book's best insights in under 20 minutes and gives you a discussion guide that you can use to share some of the insights with your team. You can find it at superteamsmasterclass.com. It's completely free when you get the book. And because I really want to help you apply these insights, not just read about them.
Love it. Thank you so much for joining me today once again. And for those listening, if you heard one idea today that made you think, that's us, we're in that collaboration trap, or we've never actually protected focus as a team, I'd encourage you to treat it not as guilt, but as a starting point. Pick one of these practices Ron described, run it as a 30-day experiment with your team, and see what changes. Once again, thank you for joining us. And until next time, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes the difference. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. Remember, great ideas only matter when they change what you do next. So choose one insight from today's conversation and put it into practice this week. If this episode was valuable, follow the show and share it with someone who would benefit. And until next time, remember, the edge belongs to those who outlearned what worked yesterday, who can outthink what's coming next so that they can outperform when it counts.